Picture this. You're sitting in the wooden pew, the familiar scent of incense filling your nostrils, the soft murmur of prayers echoing through the sanctuary. The priest stands at the altar, his hands raised in consecration, transforming ordinary bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. Everything feels sacred, peaceful, exactly as it should be during this most holy moment of the Mass. But then, in an instant that will forever change your understanding of divine protection and human courage, something unthinkable happens. A man bursts through the sanctuary doors, his face twisted with rage, screaming obscenities that pierce through the reverent silence like a knife through velvet. He charges toward the altar with violent intent, and in that split second, as your heart pounds and your mind struggles to process what's unfolding before your eyes, you witness something that will challenge everything you thought you knew about faith under fire. What happened next in that small parish church in rural Kentucky wasn't just a news story that would fade from headlines within a week. It wasn't just another unfortunate incident of violence in our increasingly troubled world. What transpired in those terrifying moments became a living testament to a truth that Saint Ignatius of Loyola discovered 5 centuries ago during his own moment of crisis, lying wounded on a battlefield in Pamplona. It revealed the profound reality that in our darkest hour, when evil seems to have the upper hand and faith appears vulnerable, God's grace doesn't abandon us. Instead, it transforms ordinary people into extraordinary vessels of divine love, courage, and protection. You see, when that disturbed individual lunged toward Father Martinez, who was celebrating his first Mass in this small community, after being transferred from a parish in the inner city, where violence was unfortunately more common, something remarkable happened that nobody in that congregation will ever forget. As the attacker raised his hand to strike the priest, an elderly woman named Margaret, who had been coming to daily Mass for over 60 years, rose from her front pew with a speed and determination that defied her 83 years. Without hesitation, without calculating the risk to herself, without considering her frail frame against this much larger, younger man, she stepped directly between the attacker and the priest. But here's where this story becomes truly extraordinary, where we see the kind of supernatural intervention that Saint Ignatius wrote about in his spiritual exercises, when he described how God works through human instruments to accomplish his will. Margaret didn't just physically intercede. She did something that stopped the attacker cold in his tracks. She looked directly into his eyes, and with a voice that carried the authority of decades spent in prayer and communion with the Almighty, she said, "Son, you are loved. You are loved by God, and you are loved by me. Whatever pain has brought you here today, violence is not the answer. Let me help you." The entire congregation held its breath. The attacker's hand, which had been raised to strike, slowly lowered to his side. Tears began streaming down his face as he collapsed to his knees right there in the sanctuary. Through his sobs, he began pouring out a story of loss, addiction, and desperation that had brought him to this breaking point. His mother had died just weeks before, and she used to take him to this very church when he was a child. In his grief-stricken, drug-addled state, he had somehow convinced himself that God and the church were responsible for all his suffering. Father Martinez, still shaken but moved by Margaret's courage and the obvious pain of this troubled soul, slowly approached and knelt beside the man. Instead of calling for his removal, instead of pressing charges, the priest did something that embodied the very essence of Ignatian spirituality. He placed his hand on the man's shoulder and said, "God has brought you here today, not to commit violence, but to find healing. Your mother's prayers are still working, even now." This is the kind of moment that Saint Ignatius would have recognized immediately as a movement of the Holy Spirit, a demonstration of what he called finding God in all things, even in the most unexpected and frightening circumstances. But there's something even deeper happening here that speaks to the heart of what it means to live an authentic spiritual life in a world that often seems hostile to faith. Margaret's response wasn't born from a sudden burst of courage that came out of nowhere. It was the fruit of decades of what Ignatius called the daily exam, the practice of recognizing God's presence and action in every moment of ordinary life. Let me pause here for a moment because I want to connect with you personally about something that might be stirring in your heart right now. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where your faith was tested, where you had to choose between safety and doing what you knew was right? Maybe it wasn't as dramatic as what happened in that church, but perhaps it was standing up for someone being bullied at work, or speaking truth to a friend who was making destructive choices, or simply maintaining your beliefs when everyone around you was pressuring you to compromise. If you've ever felt that tension between fear and faith, I want you to know that you're not alone in that struggle. Margaret herself later admitted that she was terrified in that moment, but something deeper than fear moved her to action. If this resonates with your own experience, I invite you to share it in the comments. You can simply write, "I too have chosen courage over comfort." And if you feel comfortable, tell us about a time when your faith called you to step forward despite your fear. Your story could be exactly what someone else needs to read today to find the courage for their own moment of decision. Sometimes, knowing that others have faced similar tests and found strength in their faith is all we need to take our own next step toward a deeper relationship with God. Now, what Margaret demonstrated that day wasn't heroism in the Hollywood sense, where courage comes from inner strength and personal determination. This was what Saint Ignatius called supernatural courage, the kind that flows from a deep relationship with Jesus Christ and a profound trust in God's providence. You see, for 60 years, Margaret had been practicing what Ignatian spirituality teaches about discernment of spirits. She had learned to recognize the difference between movements that come from God and those that come from fear, anger, or evil. In that terrifying moment when chaos erupted in the sanctuary, Margaret was able to discern immediately that this wasn't just a random act of violence, but a human soul in desperate need of love and intervention. Her response came not from analyzing the situation intellectually, but from a heart that had been trained through decades of prayer to recognize God's call even in the most unexpected circumstances. This is exactly what Saint Ignatius meant when he wrote about contemplation in action, the ability to see God at work and join him in that work, even when it requires tremendous personal risk. The story of what happened next is equally remarkable. Instead of having the man arrested, Father Martinez and Margaret worked together with the parish community to get him the help he needed. They connected him with a treatment program, provided temporary housing, and surrounded him with a support network that helped him begin the long journey of healing from addiction and grief. But here's the part that reveals the true supernatural dimension of this story. Within 6 months, this same man who had come to attack a priest was baptized in that very church, with Margaret serving as his sponsor. This transformation didn't happen because of human psychology or social work techniques, though those played a role. It happened because Margaret and Father Martinez understood something fundamental about Ignatian spirituality that most of us miss in our daily lives. They understood that every person we encounter, no matter how broken or threatening they may appear, is a beloved child of God who carries within them an infinite capacity for transformation through grace. They saw beyond the immediate threat to the deeper reality of God's love, working even in the midst of apparent chaos. Saint Ignatius learned this same truth during his own conversion experience. When he was wounded in battle and forced to spend months in recovery, he could have become bitter about the end of his military career. Instead, he used that time to recognize God's providence working even through his suffering. He discovered that what initially appeared to be a devastating setback was actually God's way of calling him to a far greater mission. This perspective, this ability to see God's hand at work even in difficult circumstances, became the foundation of everything he would later teach about spiritual discernment and finding God in all things. The practical implications of this story for your own spiritual life are profound and immediate. How often do you find yourself responding to difficult people or challenging situations with fear, anger, or the desire to protect yourself at all costs? This is natural and human, but Ignatian spirituality invites us to go deeper, to ask what God might be trying to accomplish through this very situation that seems so troubling on the surface. Margaret's response that day didn't come from years of theology study or advanced spiritual training. It came from the simple daily practice of what Saint Ignatius called the examen. The practice of reflecting each day on where you noticed God's presence and action. Through this daily attention to God's movement in ordinary moments, Margaret had developed what we might call supernatural reflexes, the ability to recognize and respond to God's call even under extreme pressure. This is something you can begin developing in your own life starting today. The exam doesn't require special knowledge or lengthy prayer sessions. It simply involves taking a few minutes each evening to ask yourself 2 questions. Where did I notice God today? And where do I need God's grace tomorrow? Through this simple practice, you begin to develop the same spiritual sensitivity that allowed Margaret to see beyond the immediate threat to the deeper reality of God's love at work. But there's another dimension to this story that speaks directly to one of the most common struggles in modern spiritual life. So many people today feel that their faith is somehow disconnected from the real world, that prayer and spirituality are fine for church on Sunday, but don't have much relevance for the practical challenges they face Monday through Friday. What happened in that church demonstrates powerfully that authentic spiritual life isn't separate from real-world situations. It's precisely what prepares us to respond to those situations, with wisdom, courage, and love. Consider how differently this story might have ended if Margaret had been someone who treated her faith as merely a private, personal matter that didn't extend beyond her own inner peace. If her spirituality had been focused only on personal consolation and comfort, she never would have been prepared for the moment when God called her to risk her safety for the sake of another. But because she had spent decades understanding her faith as a call to serve others and recognize Christ in every person she encountered, she was ready when that ultimate test came. This is what Saint Ignatius meant by his famous prayer, the Sucipe. Take, Lord, and receive all my liberty, my memory, my understanding, and my entire will, all I have and call my own. Margaret had already made this offering in her daily life, so when the moment came to demonstrate it in action, her response was almost automatic. She had already decided long ago that her life belonged not to herself, but to God, and that commitment prepared her to act with supernatural courage when the situation demanded it. The transformation of the man who attacked the church is equally instructive for understanding how God works through human instruments to accomplish his purposes. His healing didn't begin with therapy or medication, though those became important parts of his recovery. It began with an encounter with unconditional love at the moment when he most expected rejection and punishment. Margaret's response communicated to him more powerfully than any sermon or theological argument that God's love is not conditional on our behavior, but is available even to those who come in anger and violence. This is the heart of what Saint Ignatius discovered about God's way of working in human hearts. Divine love doesn't wait for us to clean up our act or prove ourselves worthy. It meets us exactly where we are, in our brokenness and confusion, and begins the work of transformation from that very point. The man who came to attack a priest encountered this reality not through religious education or convincing arguments, but through the lived witness of two people who had learned to embody Christ's love in their daily actions. What makes this story even more remarkable is what we learn about Father Martinez's own journey. In interviews afterward, he revealed that he had been struggling with doubts about his calling to the priesthood. The transfer to this rural parish had been difficult for him after years of urban ministry, and he had been questioning whether he was making any real difference in people's lives. The morning of the attack, he had actually been considering requesting another transfer, or even taking a leave of absence to reconsider his vocation. But witnessing Margaret's courage, and participating in the subsequent healing and transformation of his would-be attacker, gave Father Martinez a renewed understanding of how God works through ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things. He realized that his role as a priest wasn't to be a superhero who single-handedly fights evil, but to be a faithful witness who creates space for God's grace to work through the entire community of believers. This insight transformed not only his understanding of priesthood, but his approach to ministry. Instead of seeing himself as the primary agent of change in his parish, he began to recognize and cultivate the gifts that God had already placed within his congregation. He started training other parishioners in the kind of spiritual discernment that had enabled Margaret to respond with such wisdom and courage. The result was a parish community that became known throughout the region for its ability to reach out to struggling individuals and families with practical help and spiritual support. The ripple effects of that moment of violence turned to healing continue to spread years later. The man who was baptized after his transformation has become a powerful witness to others struggling with addiction, sharing his story at treatment centers and churches throughout the state. Margaret, despite her advanced age, has become something of a local legend, but not in the way you might expect. She doesn't speak at conferences or write books about her experience. Instead, she continues to attend daily Mass, pray for others, and practice the same simple spiritual disciplines that prepared her for that moment of crisis. What this teaches us about authentic spiritual life is crucial for anyone serious about growing closer to God. Real sanctity doesn't announce itself with dramatic gestures or spectacular miracles. It develops through the patient daily practice of small acts of love, attention to God's presence, and readiness to respond when grace calls us to action. Margaret's heroism wasn't born in the moment of crisis. It was cultivated through decades of what might have seemed like ordinary, unremarkable faithfulness. This is where the genius of Saint Ignatius's spiritual teaching becomes most apparent. He understood that the spiritual life isn't about achieving peak religious experiences or having mystical visions, though these can certainly be part of the journey. The spiritual life is about developing the kind of intimate relationship with God that enables us to recognize His will and respond to it with generosity, even when that response requires significant sacrifice. The daily exam that formed the foundation of Margaret's spiritual sensitivity is something that anyone can practice, regardless of their level of theological education or previous religious experience. It's simply a matter of paying attention to God's movement in your daily life and asking how you can cooperate more fully with His grace. Over time, this practice develops what Saint Ignatius called spiritual discretion, the ability to distinguish between movements that draw us closer to God and those that lead us away from Him. In Margaret's case, this discretion enabled her to recognize immediately that responding to the attacker with fear and self-protection would only escalate the violence, while responding with love and compassion might create an opening for healing. This wasn't calculated strategy on her part. It was the natural outflow of a heart that had been trained to see every situation as an opportunity for God's grace to work. The practical application for your own spiritual journey is both simple and profound. Begin today to practice the daily exam, not as another religious obligation to check off your list, but as a way of developing greater sensitivity to God's presence in your ordinary experiences. Ask yourself each evening where you noticed God at work in your day and where you might have missed opportunities to cooperate with His grace. Over time, you'll find that this simple practice transforms not only your prayer life, but your ability to respond to unexpected challenges with wisdom and love. But there's something else this story reveals about the nature of authentic spiritual courage that challenges much of what our culture teaches about bravery and heroism. Margaret's courage wasn't rooted in self-confidence or belief in her own strength. In fact, she later said that she felt completely inadequate to the situation and was terrified of making things worse. Her courage came from a deep trust that God would provide whatever was needed in the moment if she simply made herself available to be used. This is a fundamentally different understanding of courage than what we typically encounter in movies or popular culture. It's not the courage of the self-made individual who conquers challenges through force of will and personal determination. It's the courage of surrender, the bravery that comes from knowing that you belong to God and that He can work through your weaknesses as powerfully as through your strengths. Saint Ignatius himself exemplified this kind of courage throughout his life. When he felt called to go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem despite having no money or means of transportation, he didn't wait until he felt confident about the journey. He simply began walking, trusting that God would provide what was needed along the way. When he was called to begin a new religious order despite having no experience in religious leadership, he didn't wait until he felt qualified. He said yes to God's call and trusted that divine grace would make up for his human inadequacies. This understanding of courage has immediate relevance for anyone who feels called to make changes in their life, but is held back by fear of inadequacy or failure. Perhaps you feel called to have a difficult conversation with a family member, to make a career change that aligns better with your values, to volunteer for a cause you care about, or to deepen your spiritual life through more committed prayer and service. The example of Margaret and the teaching of Saint Ignatius remind us that we don't have to wait until we feel fully prepared or confident. We simply have to be willing to make ourselves available to God's grace and trust that He will provide whatever wisdom and strength we need. The transformation that occurred in that small church also illustrates something crucial about how God works to heal the divisions and violence in our world. The healing didn't begin with programs or policies, though these can certainly be important tools. It began with one person's decision to see beyond surface appearances to the deeper reality of human dignity and divine love. Margaret didn't see a dangerous criminal who needed to be stopped. She saw a suffering child of God who needed love and healing. This kind of vision is exactly what Jesus was teaching when He told His followers to love their enemies and pray for those who persecute them. It's not a naive optimism that ignores the reality of evil and suffering. It's a supernatural way of seeing that recognizes God's image in every person and believes in the possibility of redemption even in the most hopeless circumstances. For those of us living in a time when division and hostility seem to dominate public discourse, Margaret's example offers a powerful alternative to responding to conflict with more conflict. It shows us what happens when someone trained in Ignatian spirituality encounters aggression, not with defensive reaction, but with the kind of love that disarms evil and creates space for transformation. As we near the end of our time together reflecting on this remarkable story, I want to return to the question that began our journey. What happens when faith is tested by violence, when our spiritual beliefs encounter the raw reality of human brokenness and evil? The answer we've discovered through Margaret's courage and the attacker's transformation is both simple and profound. God's love is more powerful than any force that opposes it, and He delights in working through ordinary people who make themselves available to be instruments of His grace. The daily spiritual practices that Saint Ignatius taught aren't just methods for personal spiritual growth, though they certainly accomplish that important goal. They're training for the moments when God calls us to be His hands and feet in a hurting world. The daily exam, contemplative prayer, spiritual discernment, and the practice of finding God in all things prepare us for the times when our faith will be tested and our courage will be required. But perhaps the most important lesson from this story is that you don't have to wait for a crisis to begin living with the kind of spiritual sensitivity and courage that Margaret demonstrated. Every day offers opportunities to practice responding to difficult people and challenging situations with love rather than fear, with trust in God's providence, rather than reliance on your own limited resources. Every interaction with a difficult coworker, every encounter with someone who disagrees with your beliefs, every moment when you're tempted to respond defensively rather than with compassion, is an opportunity to practice the kind of spiritual courage that can transform not only your own life, but the lives of those around you. The man who came to attack Father Martinez never expected to encounter the kind of love that met him at that altar. He came expecting judgment, punishment, and rejection. Instead, he found acceptance, healing, and hope. This transformation was possible because Margaret and Father Martinez had spent years learning to see every person as Christ in disguise, to recognize every difficult situation as an opportunity for grace to work. If these reflections on Saint Ignatius's teachings and this remarkable story of courage and transformation have stirred something in your heart, I invite you to join our community of souls seeking a deeper spiritual life. By subscribing to this channel, we'll continue exploring together the teachings of the saints that can illuminate your path of faith and prepare you for your own moments when God calls you to extraordinary courage. Each week, we share stories and insights designed to help you recognize God's presence in your ordinary experiences and respond to His grace with greater generosity. You are not alone in this spiritual journey. Many of us are learning to live our faith with greater authenticity and courage in a world that desperately needs the witness of transformed lives. Thank you for dedicating this time to nourishing your soul and considering how God might be calling you to be an instrument of His peace in your own circumstances. The legacy of that day in rural Kentucky continues to unfold in ways that none of the participants could have imagined. But perhaps that's exactly the point of living a spiritual life rooted in trust rather than control, in love rather than fear, in hope rather than despair. When we make ourselves available to be used by God for purposes beyond our understanding, we become part of a story much larger and more beautiful than anything we could write on our own. The question that remains is not whether God will provide opportunities for us to participate in His work of healing and transformation. The question is whether we will be ready to recognize those opportunities when they come and respond with the kind of courageous love that changes everything it touches.